Want to find out what a wild horse family is and how they live together on our public lands? This is episode 3 of Freedom for Wild Horses, and I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. Welcome to the Freedom for Wild Horses podcast, the place to find out about wild horses in the American West and what you can do to help them stay wild and free. If you love wildlife, wild horses, and the freedom that they stand for, this show is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. Something essential that distinguishes wild horses from domestic horses is that wild horses live in family bands. A wild horse family can be as small as a stallion and a mare. Most families have a stallion, several mares, young fillies and colts, and young foals. Sometimes the mares and the stallion have been together for as long as a decade. Mares with very tight bonds of friendship are often sisters or mothers and daughters. For example, in Wyoming's McCullough Peaks herd, the red and white pinto mare Trade Bead was together with her daughter Ruger for over 10 years until her death. Their stallion Tecumseh lost his family to a younger, bigger stallion named Mesquite, but the mother and daughter stayed together. Many people think that the stallion is in charge and calls all the shots. He gets the mares submit to him, and he tells them what to do. The truth is, it depends. If the mares do not like a stallion, they will not stay with him. They will make life as difficult as possible for him until he gives up, or until another stallion they like better comes along. Often there will be an experienced mare who leads the family to the water, to the best grazing, to the best places to shelter during a storm, and she'll be the one who runs in front of the family to escape danger. The stallion is usually the one who's in the back, bringing up the rear, looking for danger, making sure everything's okay. However, I have known control freak stallions who are constantly snaking their mares. Snaking is a behavior when the stallion extends their neck out long and low, ears pinned, and uses his body language to drive the family in the desired direction. I have noticed constant snaking is a behavior that younger, insecure stallions use. The more mature, assured stallions are more relaxed in their attitude. One of the stallions I got to know very well was Blue Zeus, and he lived in the Red Desert Complex in Wyoming in Arapahoe Creek. It might be his idea to move to water or to better grazing, but I never saw him snaking his mares around. One of the mares would lead the family, and he'd bring up the rear, but it looked coordinated and calm, as if they were all communicating silently. The older stallions would also seem to be more curious about me and more relaxed in my presence. I found that older stallions tend to be much more relaxed about life than the younger stallions who are just really concentrating on keeping their mare or mares together and keeping other stallions away. Something I'm seeing more and more, especially in herds who've suffered a roundup and had families split apart, is that more than one stallion can be in a family. There can be another young stallion called a lieutenant who helps the head stallion keep the family together, and sometimes is allowed to breed one or more of the mares. There's one family right now in the Red Desert Complex who has 3 stallions, and it seems a little bit confused as to who's in charge. I'm thinking that probably by spring they may have worked out who exactly that is. But the most extraordinary example of a main stallion and lieutenant stallions that I've witnessed is the Big Band in Arapahoe Creek, Wyoming. There were 16 horses in this family, the largest family in the herd, and the lead stallion, Azul, was a beefy blue roan with a scarred coat, no doubt from countless battles. He was usually found in the middle of his strikingly beautiful family, There were red pintos, buckskins, bay roans, and a gorgeous older white mare with red stripes on her face that looked like a mask. I called her Mascara. Azul's family had 2 lieutenants, a bay roan pinto named Spartan and a buckskin pinto named Hercules. Spartan was the older of the 2, and I assumed they were both sons of Azul. They would take up the rear a bit behind the family when they moved, and they would be quick to drive off other stallions from other families who might get too close. It was an amazing sight seeing this huge family on the move. One of my favorite memories was one day, as the foals were sleeping and the mares were grazing, I was sitting and watching the big band. The whole family suddenly went on alert, ears up, necks stiff, and the foals got up. I didn't know what was going on, and I looked, and there was a man on a bicycle coming down the county road. This was a much stranger sight to the horses than a vehicle. They ran from the road, then stopped as the bicycle moved on by, and then they went back to grazing. This family was unfortunately rounded up and separated and removed from their home in the 2020 roundup. The most unique band of horses I've ever observed was in Adobe Town in Wyoming. I saw from a distance 3 dappled grays moving together, and as I approached, I saw that all 3 were mares. They looked as though they were related, and the oldest mare, who was the lightest in color, was snaking and moving her daughters, just like a stallion. Her coat was even scarred with bites like a stallion. I watched in fascination as they moved on by me. I've never before or since seen a family of just mares. However, it's quite common to see groups of young stallions together. We call those Bachelor Bands. When the young colts reach 2 to 3 years of age, it's common for the stallion to chase them out of their natal family, for fear they might someday take over the family. In the Prairie Mountains of Montana, the wild stallion Shaman made the mistake of letting Boulder stay with the family until he was 5 years old. Boulder formed tight bonds with the mares in the family, and he made his move to take over the family. And the fights between him and Shaman were distressingly violent and fierce. Although Shaman was an older stallion, he did not give up his family easily and followed them for a month before finally giving up and moving off on his own. The bachelor stallions can form loose groups together and play fight, sparring and practicing their skills before they win their own families. They cause trouble, and they're a lot of fun to watch. I remember one morning in the Prairie Mountains of Montana, there was a group of colorful young bachelor stallions who came running through a field where about 9 families were peacefully grazing and sleeping. They ran by the families, they ran through them, and several stallions chased them as they ran up and down the hills, stirring up trouble and eyeing the mares. Later that night, when I was trying to sleep in my tent, I heard them running up and down the road, whinnying, grunting, and squealing, and at one point right next to my tent, so that I poked the side and yelled so they would not run over me. One of the most endearing parts of the family are the foals. These are the young babies that have been born that year. The gestation period for mares is 11 months, and the foals are usually born at night to give them a better chance of evading predators. They're able to get up and walk and follow the family within a very short time after their birth. For the first month or so, they spend most of their time sleeping and eating, and often the whole family will be resting and sleeping in the mid-morning with the foals. They're mostly born in the spring and summer, and during that time, the mares have a much easier time coming up with enough milk to feed them when the grass is rich and full. When families have more than one foal, then they'll play together, usually having the most energy to run and chase each other in the early morning or at dusk when it's cooler. Sometimes foals will play with foals from other families. It depends upon how protective the stallions are. This October, in Saltwell's Creek, I watched as a curly sorrel coat, whose mane stood on end like he'd been shocked, wandered over to play with a sorrel colt from another family. They ran and reared and bit each other's legs for a few minutes until Dollar, a gray curly stallion, wandered over and broke it up, chasing his son back to the band. The colt clacked submissively. This is when the youngsters open and close their mouths at adults as if to say, "Don't hurt me, I'm little." Dollar then walked back to his family, content that they were all together. Some stallions are more protective than others of the foals. I've seen some stallions ignore the foals, and then I've seen some stallions be concerned when a foal is sleeping and they're moving on, and he'll go back and get them, waking them up, and then the foal runs to catch up with his mother. When fillies reach 1.5 to 2 years old and go into estrus for the first time, they'll find another stallion or another family to go with. Families are the heart of wild horse society. And there's also a pecking order. This is best shown in the Prairie Mountains of Montana, where I've been sitting at a waterhole waiting for the horses to come in to drink. And I'll find families lined up on the hillside like planes getting ready to take off, with the most senior family going first to go get water. And it's the stallion who's the most senior stallion. And the other families wait until they're done, and then they move down and they get their turn to drink. And usually the bachelors are the last ones who get to go and drink. Families are the heart of wild horse society. When a stallion such as Corona of Sandwash Basin was rounded up with a helicopter in 2008, he had his mare Cheyenne, a gorgeous Cremello Pinto, with him. And then, although they were separated at the time of the roundup and put in separate pens and released separately, he found her again after the roundup. She was his lead mare for many years before she passed away. During the roundup of Sandwash Basin in 2021, Corona's family was again captured. He escaped. His lead mare, M, was released, but they did not find each other, and he passed away last month alone. Stallions live for their families, and they usually don't last more than a year or two after they lose them to a younger rival. I've seen them alone, watching their old families. Sometimes they get together with other stallions and hang out together, but their real purpose in their lives is to take care of their family. Mares are the heart of the family, and they keep the families together. They birth and nurture the next generation, and this keeps the herd alive. I've heard members of BLM staff deny that wild horses live in families, because how else can the roundups breaking these families apart forever be justified? The cruelty of the separation and loss is written on the faces and bodies of the horses left behind at the end of the roundup. Bewildered and stunned, I have seen stallions like Abelardo, a handsome pinto stallion who had a huge, beautiful family before the 2020 Red Desert Complex roundup, wandering the lands he calls home, looking in vain for his family. Last year, he found a mare and foal and has been tenderly taking care of them. He's no longer alone, but his old family is gone forever. Wild horse families aren't static. You have the youngsters leaving home. You have the stallions gaining new mares and losing some. And then you have younger stallions challenging the older stallions for their families. Every time I go out, I see changes to different families. But it doesn't mean that families aren't important and that families don't continue and don't give a continuity to wild horse society. Wild horses and their families need to be respected and managed humanely on the lands they call home. We can learn so much by observing and studying their behavior, societal structure, and they deserve to live out their entire lives free on our public lands. One of my favorite wild horse families in McCullough Peaks in Wyoming was Indigo's band. and he had this huge family. And one summer, there were 2 foals born about the same time, just about a week or 2 apart. One was a Cremello and one was an all-white Pinto, and I called them the Cremello Colts. And they were inseparable. They played, they ran, they caused trouble, and they stayed together in the family until Indigo decided it was time for them to go, when they were both about 3 years old. And right about that time, there was a roundup, and the entire family was rounded up by helicopter and removed and separated. And I found out that the 2 boys had been sent to an adoption and no one had taken them. And I couldn't imagine them ever being separated. So I called Steve Mantle, who had them at his ranch at the time, and I asked him what was going to happen, and he said he was going to put them online for adoption. And most likely they would have been separated. I just couldn't see that happening. And so I set up a time to go get them. And I went with a trainer who helped me pick them up and take them, and I adopted them. And it was a wonderful thing being able to keep the 2 boys together. They had lost everything except each other. And it's just not right what's done to these horses. They have feelings, they have families, they have bonds, and they shouldn't be put through the terrible cruelty of the roundups. They shouldn't be put through losing everything. They should be able to remain free on our public lands. And if their numbers need to be managed, they should be managed humanely, using birth control, not being rounded up, separated, trucked to holding facilities, and left there to sit for months, years. It's not the way to manage our wild horses. Today I've talked about the importance of wild horse families and preserving them. You can follow this podcast and my blog at wildhoofbeats.com for news and alerts and ways that you can help. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. To celebrate the launch of the show, I'm going to be giving away a 12-inch by 18-inch metal print of Blue Zeus called Into the Blue and 2 signed copies of my book, Blue Zeus, Legend of the Red Desert. I'm going to be giving them away to 3 lucky listeners who follow, rate, and review the show. Now, it doesn't have to be a 5-star review, although I sure hope you love the show. I really want your honest feedback so I can create an awesome show that provides tons of value. Visit www.wildhoofbeats.com/podcast launch to learn more about the contest and how to enter. I'll be announcing the winners on the show in episode 10. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you want to learn more, follow me at www.wildhoofbeats.com for more information and for ways to help America's wild horses. See you next time.